Kia ora and welcome to the Niggly Niche Cast. This is your boy, the Diggity Doodah Dr. Papatoe Panther, here for another beautiful episode of Kiwi Sporting Matters with the Wobbly Wildcard. Today on the agenda, we've got a little bit about the Women's Football World Cup. Obviously, there is also the big UFC fight going down this weekend with Dan Hooker taking on Dustin Poirier in Las Vegas. So I'll give my final assessment of that fight. And the NBL, the Aotearoa NBL has started, and it's pretty funky. So we're going to spend a couple of minutes talking about the NBL and just some positive emergence out of the pandemic that the UFC and the NBL are actually at the forefront of. So that's bloody fantastic. The best way to support the Niche Case is on Patreon. Straight up the guts. That's how we do it. Shout out to all our Patrons out there doing your thing. We appreciate your support, and we hope you're doing well across the lands of Aotearoa and internationally as well. Tomorrow we'll be delivering another email newsletter. So sign up to the email newsletter for a bit of funky bits and bobs, extras that come straight to your email as well. Wobbly Wildcard, how are ya?
Yeah, mate. Still sort of shrugging off the last vestiges of my I guess it was just a cold. I don't know. But at the same time, also got up early this morning and watched Manchester United get a nice hefty victory. So, you know, the world giveth and the world taketh in equal measures, and you just focus on the good stuff. Bloody Champions League, here we come.
Too right. There's a fair bit of buzz around the hosting of a Women's World Cup. Is it Aotearoa and Australia, or for the Football World Cup? Is that a crossover jointly held possibility? With the as one. So what's the deal with that? How are you feeling about that? What kind of time frames are we looking at? What's the deal for those of us who are seeing it around the news, but not necessarily tapped into that world? Break it on down for us non-footballing plebs.
Yeah, so like when the news of this bid first emerged, the thing I couldn't get my head around was why Australia needed New Zealand to be involved in the first place. Like, I kind of figured they could have just as strong a bid, if not stronger, just being Australia lone bidders, but so it goes. But it's been nice and cool the way they've sort of like chipped in with a consistent media presence since then, keeping the buzz around. Obviously, it would be amazing to have a Women's World Cup co-hosted in New Zealand, especially at a time where like women's football is just skyrocketing, and each successive World Cup is just like enormously bigger and, you know, more of a massive thing. And this, if that continues on the thing, like, there's obviously no way New Zealand could host an actual FIFA World Cup in this capacity. I just said something terribly sexist, didn't I? The men's World Cup anyway. Apologies for my slip of the tongue there. I fell into FIFA guidelines there for a second. Just because of the scope of it. So this might be the last chance we get to host a tournament as enormous as this. So obviously, like, what that would do for the game and the country, enormous, amazing, and all incredible things there. They're getting to the final stages. If you're listening to this after Friday night, is it Friday night or is it early Friday morning? I forget now. Might be Thursday night going into Friday morning, where they're going to announce the winners, like the actual hosts of the event. It's down to two. It's Australia/New Zealand, and it's Colombia. And it's one of those things where, like, I thought for a long time there, I sort of figured Japan had the best bid, and then they did the old FIFA technical assessment thingies where they send FIFA sends their goons around to investigate the various aspects of the infrastructure and the sponsorship capabilities and all this kind of thing, all the stuff that goes into hosting a major tournament. New Zealand and Australia, or Australia and New Zealand, however you want to look at it, came out with the the highest scoring bid. This was about 2 weeks ago or something. We got a 4.3. Japan got a 4.1. Brazil decided they no longer were interested, so they backed out. And Colombia got a 2.8. Colombia are rather pissed off about that. They think it was a little bit rigged and that they've drawn in elements of their society that don't apply to the hosting of this game in terms of how they've judged health risks and stuff like that. There's a few quotes floating around about that. They're not too happy. And then just recently, Japan backed out. And I think the reason Japan backed out is because they must have just decided that Australia and New Zealand had a slightly better, which is what FIFA suggested as well, just by the scores, slightly better, what do you call it, just the quality of their bid, just ever so slightly better, and Japan and Australia obviously both representing the Asian Confederation, so there would have been an element of split votes there. You obviously want to have all your ducks in a row, so Japan backed out and put their support fully behind the Australia-New Zealand bid. When the voting happens, this is where it gets really interesting, because up until that point, I sort of didn't really feel like it was possible that Australia and New Zealand could win this, and then suddenly Japan backed out, and I'm like, well, straight up, we're favourites here. Like, this, we should be getting this now. Like, it shouldn't really be a fingers crossed, knock on wood situation. This is the best bid remaining on the table. Then I read a few things this morning which made it really funky and typical, like, just perfectly FIFA fashion. And some people maybe think that FIFA isn't as corrupt anymore because they got rid of old mate Blatter. And they're certainly not corrupt in the same way. Like, Blatter was just an old school kind of mafia don. He was given, like, the suitcases of cash under the table and those kind of things. Pretty obvious, not really hiding it too much about what was going on. Everyone knew, and it was just their power allowed them to get away with it until it didn't. Gianni Infantino is pretty much an equally corrupt man, just in a different way. He's a very, like, corporate-y type. He's corrupt in the way that, like, Amazon and Facebook are corrupt, which is a more modern version of it, with heavy on the branding and the obfuscation of people, of what's going on and those kind of things. So when they vote, there are 35 votes that get cast. So obviously you need a majority of, what would that be, 18. The Australia-New Zealand bid can count on 10 automatically. They will get the two votes out of Oceania. They'll get the 7 votes out of Asia. And they're almost certainly going to get Infantino's vote as FIFA president as well, because he's not going to be a dumbass and vote against his own organization's technical assessment suggestions. He's obviously going to pick the one that got the highest score on their own measurement. But UEFA are being weird about it, and UEFA is suggesting that it should go to Colombia, and there was some weird-ass quote in The Guardian about how they think it's a development tournament, therefore you got to spread it around, which, first of all, I would have thought that would further enhance New Zealand and Australia's chances anyway. Second of all, like, just a terrible thing to say. It's obviously it's the pinnacle of women's football. It's not a development tournament. But UEFA might be voting, and if that's the case, for whatever reason, they seem to think Colombia are more deserving in that way. You don't know how the Americas are going to go. All the South American teams will vote for Colombia, obviously, confederational solidarity. But we don't know how we don't know if UEFA are going to vote unanimously in one way or the other, or if because they got about 9 votes or something. They're the confederation with the most sway. Africa are undecided on the matter. You got North and Central America as well. So it's suddenly a trickier one. Just as I thought it was looking like we probably had this one in the bag down under. It's suddenly a bit of a crazy FIFA politics, and just the most, like, typically FIFA insane way, which is awful and also hilarious at the same time.
Yeah, it's a strange old one, considering, like, the excitement around a World Cup, a football World Cup hosting bid, and then everyone knows that it's a shit show. Everyone knows that FIFA and handing out World Cups is basically a scam. So, and then you've got wholesome New Zealand and slightly less wholesome Australia leading their own World Cup hosting bid. It's a interesting cauldron of morals, ethics, and to differing degrees, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I'll throw this well, it's not a hypothetical. I'll throw this thought experiment, or just a thought. I'll throw this thought towards you. This is the 2023 Women's World Cup that we're talking about. That obviously happen every 4 years. So the 2019 one was the previous one. 2019 was last year. Last year was the previous World Cup. We're only 3 years out from the next Women's World Cup, and we still don't actually know who will host it, which seems insane considering the 2022 Men's World Cup in Qatar, which shouldn't be in Qatar for various reasons, some human rights reasons, even just straight up like the fact that they're going to have to change the timing of the tournament to interrupt the European season because it's too hot to play summer football in Qatar, because people will probably die trying to do that. People are already dying actually building their stadiums and stuff like that. So it's like shambolically corrupt. But when they were awarded the World Cup hosting rights, that was back in 2010 or 2011, one of those 2 years. So more than a decade out from the actual event. At the same time that they awarded, like, the vote was the same, whatever, it was the same vote. They awarded Russia the 2018 World Cup and then Qatar the 2022 World Cup. Need I say that this was back in the bladder reign, and that I think of all the whoever you call them, the Confederate representatives who voted for Qatar, I can't remember how many of them were. There would have been about same old, like 20 odd or something like that. Every single one of them has at least been accused of corruption in that time. Several of them have been straight up banned from football for life, and a whole bunch others have been like involved in like corruption scandals and either been sanctioned or fined, or those kind of things. So like it basically, the entire vote was enormously like, it shouldn't even be happening at this point. It's they've just all along said, well, it's too late, we can't really change anything, it's already whatever. But it just shows first of all, it shows you what the inner workings of FIFA are like in a way that everyone already knew, but just highlighting that a little bit more. And then it also shows a massive differential between the Men's World Cup and the Women's World Cup, that they could award an enormously corrupt vote to two of the most corrupt countries on the planet. At least Russia had the infrastructure to host it, though, and did a decent enough job. A decade out, whereas the Women's World Cup, you've got, as you say, like wholesome-ish Australia and wholesome old New Zealand, 3 years out from a World Cup, still trying to figure out if they're going to be allowed to host it, or if that level of corruption is going to sweep in, but to a lesser degree. Obviously, nothing is quite as bad as giving Qatar the World Cup, but it does seem like the clearly best bid. Like it's pretty obvious which one of the two that is, and at the same time, not obvious that one's going to win.
To me, wildcard, that what you're saying about the FIFA corruption, that sounds like a nice microcosm of systems that we were all in previously, and breaking down of those systems and a refreshing of those systems in all aspects of our life that we are currently experiencing. So hopefully that does not impact Aotearoa in Australia hosting the Women's Football World Cup, because it would also represent and grace us with a rather epic few years for wahine sport in Aotearoa, considering that the Cricket World Cup, Women's World Cup, is set to be hosted in Aotearoa early next year as well. So that would be pretty damn amazing. The Radio World Cup, we'll move into this the UFC. We've talked about it a fair bit over the past week and a bit, and I think this is an important moment ahead of Dan Hooker taking on Justin Poirier, because I've come to the conclusion that there is a very possible chance that Dan Hooker wins. And it's my duty to share that with the people of Aotearoa. If you want to put some money on Dan Hooker, I think you might have a very good underdog in Dan Hooker to do so. Otherwise, I think it's reason to tune in, because Dan Hooker is a very, very possible lively underdog in this fight against Dustin Poirier. And wildcard, that is interesting because, well, it's interesting because you might be able to make some money off it. It's interesting because it's an epic UFC fight and Dan Hooker's in one of the most stacked divisions in the UFC. He's a very possible underdog at the top of the division, which is all bonkers in itself. However, when put into the context of city kickboxing, I'm not sure that there has been a underdog situation like this during the city kickboxing UFC era. And I say that because thinking back to all the Israel Adesanya fights, if you know Israel Adesanya to any great extent as a UFC fighter, and so if you've seen him fight a few times, if you know what he's about, and you've got some information about city kickboxing as well, I viewed Israel Adesanya as the favorite in all of his fights. Like he's a special mixed martial artist. He's a special person, and his ascension in the UFC was very fast, but it was very fast because he was built up. And it just felt like at the start he was far too good for those early opponents in the UFC. And then by the time he got to the upper echelons of his division, he was just too good because he developed even more so quickly after entering the UFC. Like he'd grown and had so many fights that he was just in a far better position. So I always felt like Israel Adesanya was a favorite going into his fights. And then it's a bit trickier moving down to like Kai Kara France and Shane Young because they can go either way, but that's the point. Neither of them is like really an underdog because in their UFC fights they've been evenly matched up. Then I look at Brad Riddell, and again, if you know anything about Brad Riddell, he hasn't been an underdog in these fights. If you, again, with the knowledge of city kickboxing, the knowledge of what Brad Riddell does well, and who he is as a fighter, his 2 UFC fights so far, I was picking him to win. And he did that. And I think moving forward, Brad Riddell might find himself in a similar position where Dan Hooker is now, in the sense that he's an underdog higher up in the division. But to this point, whether it's Brad Riddell, whether it's Israel Adesanya, Kai Kara France, Shane Young, for whatever reason, whatever combination of circumstance, events, and who they are, I've never really viewed them as underdogs in their fights. In this fight, Dan Hooker he's an underdog because he's fighting a higher ranked opponent. He's an underdog because he's fighting someone who just fought for the title against Khabib, who is viewed as one of the best ever, if not the best ever, by the time he finishes. And then you got little old Dan Hooker coming from Aotearoa, and no one's really talked about Dan Hooker in this division. And I think, and I'll explain some tactical and stylistic things after this, but yeah, just the idea of Dan Hooker being a live underdog in this fight is something I haven't experienced to this extent with city kickboxing fighters, my time following the UFC with city kickboxing, and I think it's something that Kiwis should invest in and rally behind.
Well, even independent of the city kickboxing angle, it's just gonna make for a great fight, because when you get there's almost always in combat sports the one person who you, especially at the top sort of thing when you're dealing with rankings as well, because the rankings sort of speak for themselves often. Doesn't always speak accurately, but they have a lot to say in terms of negotiations and all this kind of thing. And there's usually one party that's coming out with the dominant sort of angles on all those kind of things. And then you just sort of, if one person's you watch Anthony Joshua fight in a world heavyweight fight kind of thing, like in boxing, you want to see Anthony Joshua fight. You enjoy watching the dude do what he does and do it pretty well, but you also sort of, for the most part, up until that Andy Ruiz complete stunner, which is why that was such an incredible result, because no one expected it. Generally, that's not going to be the case, though, in those kind of ones. The guy who is expected to win will be expected to win. But when you actually get, that live underdog kind of factor, suddenly you've still got that favorite, and you've still got that guy who is not like if you fight the fight in 100 alternate realities, more often than not they will lose, but you don't know which one is going to be the real reality, and like it just to have that kind of element of doubt going into a fight is what makes it so entertaining generally.
And it definitely is, and Dan Hooker is a vessel of entertainment in the octagon, and that is
absolutely
that is why he's such a live underdog in this fight, because I reckon there's a high chance he's going to win. And the way I see this happening, shout out to guys like Dan Hardy, shout out to guys like Luke Thomas who talk and analyze fights and break down and help me build the information in my head to form these thoughts and opinions. Dustin Poirier has like a bit of a split, not personality, but split style. So when he's fighting against someone who he is aware is equally as like brutal and just eager as he is, he's a bit more cautious. But then he recently fought, prior to the Khabib fight, he fought Max Holloway. Max Holloway was coming up a division, and Dustin Poirier being the bigger fighter and more experienced in that division. Like Max Holloway is awesome, but he was moving up a division. That just saw Dustin Poirier come out with like no respect for Holloway's power and just move forward, lean forward as well. So his head, if you're standing up straight and you imagine a line going up from the floor through your pelvis, up through your torso, and out the top of your head, that's kind of like a center line. Dan Hardy was talking about how Dustin Poirier leans forward when he's striking, and that's usually when he is like confident that he isn't going to get torched and he can just go for flurries, go for a big punch, then follow it up. But he does so with his like head and shoulders forward of that center line. And I think either scenario that Poirier goes for is going to play into Dan Hooker's hands, because if Poirier is more cautious and he's sitting on the outside and waiting for Hooker to be the lead kinda, Dan Hooker's got the reach and the skills to do well in that scenario. Dan Hooker's got a great kick to the lead leg of his opponent. He did it against Ally Quinta, did it pretty well against Paul Felder as well. And so if you're a opposition of Dan Hooker, or even the city kickboxing fighters, this is something they do very well, because Alexander Volkanovski did it against Max Holloway as well. If you're sitting on that front leg, Hooker or another city kickboxing fighter is just going to kick that leg just to change the situation of the fight, so you can't do what you want to do. And then from there you can build on other things. So if Poirier wants to stay on the outside, I think you're just going to see Hooker pace up that front leg with kicks. He's going to control the distance, and I think that puts Hooker in a strong position to win the fight. He can deal with Poirier's like grappling. There's underrated wrestling and jiu-jitsu at city kickboxing. So Hooker does have a history of submissions, so he could look for takedowns as well from the distance. But he's got the combinations, he's got the variety of strikes, and the game plan to do well from distance if Poirier is more cautious and does want to stay on the outside. If Poirier wants to go in and again lean forward, what he usually does is he'll throw a big shot that stuns the opponent or does some damage, and then he follows it up with a flurry. If Poirier wants to do that, Dan Hooker has like exceptional counter striking, which is something that we've seen from Israel Adesanya as well. And I can see a situation where Poirier's coming forward. Dan Hooker's already got a massive knockout with a knee against Ross Pearson, so he might. Like, you got to imagine. So you've got that center line, you've got Poirier leaning forward, Dan Hooker's there, he's in a stance, Poirier's leaning forward, bang, knee, straight up the middle. I can see that happening, uppercuts as well, straight up the middle, if Poirier does want to come forward. And we've seen Dan Hooker knock people out. He finishes people, not necessarily because of his power, but because of his timing and accuracy, which is another city kickboxing thing. So either situation is good for Dan Hooker, I believe, and Dan Hooker has the tools to be dangerous in either situation, which is the foundations that are present in city kickboxing's work. Good enough takedown defense, good enough grappling defense. They don't necessarily use wrestling and grappling and jiu-jitsu on the offensive side because their striking is so good. But their wrestling and jiu-jitsu and grappling is good enough. It's at a high level through the Hickman brothers and old Andre Palat, I think. Defensively, you need to have that grappling. They've got that. And then it's the feints, the strikes, the movements, switch stances, game plan with the kicks and the variety of strikes that are the foundations, the cornerstones of city kickboxing work. And Dan Hooker has all of that in spades. And I can just see him in either situation. However Poirier wants to come at this fight, I reckon Dan Hooker is going to be nicely suited to deal with it and thrive. Especially because we got to remember the masterminds of city kickboxing. So they're going to have some sort of game plan. I don't know if Eugene Behrman has flown over with Dan Hooker, though. I think he might have stayed in Aotearoa because there are other guys still training for fights. However, all the coaches with city kickboxing would have built a game plan, and I think that total package puts Dan Hooker in a fantastic position.
Beautiful. When's that fight?
Sunday, and I think the entire card starts at 9 a.m. Sunday, so you might be looking at a main event time of like 2 or 3 in the afternoon, which is beautiful. And that would be, I don't know if it's a pay-per-view or a fight night. You have to check that out, but definitely well worth the money just to see Dan Hooker fight if it is on the pay-per-view as well.
Yeah, I generally don't go with the old pay-per-view myself. Do I admit this on the podcast? There are more nefarious ways to access those things generally.
Yeah, well, Dan Hooker's probably getting a cut of the pay-per-view, to be honest, though. So if
you're going to pay for them, this is the one.
Because I think if you're the main event, you get pay-per-view points, and so that's just a note for anyone out there in Aotearoa. If we do have like a Dan Hooker, Israel Adesanya in the future, Brad Riddell, Kai Kara-France, Shane Young, any of those dudes, if they are fighting a main event on a pay-per-view card, your money isn't like, it's not like you're just giving money to the corporation kind of thing. Like the pay-per-view points that these fighters get is extra money, and you're helping that fighter by buying the pay-per-view. So that is a pretty cool thing. Also, pretty cool wildcard. I'm not sure what part of the game it was. It was like maybe sometime in the second quarter. I was watching the Auckland Huskies get absolutely destroyed. Not quite. The hefty loss to the Canterbury Rams, I think it was, in the Aotearoa NBL. And this dude, Nathan Wilson, comes off the bench and absolutely lights up that game for the Auckland Huskies. And it was to the extent wildcard. Like, he had a couple blocks, he had steals, he had points. I'm not sure if that was his, like, NBL debut.
It might have been. I don't know. I wasn't familiar with the fella beforehand. I know he's pretty fresh to the sport as well, and he's relatively young, so it very well could have been.
I think it may have been his debut. I'll double check that. But it was the craziest couple of minutes from like a new player, and if it was his debut, a player on debut in the NBL, he's only like 19 or 20, and just cruising through some of the NBL stuff here. I can't find it. And Nathan Wilson, this dude, he's got a Kevin Durant body type, tall and skinny, and he was just jumping out of the building. And my point here, Wildcard, is I've never seen like that kind of impact from someone either early in their career or on their first like appearance in the NBL. It was like a couple minutes of just absolute mayhem from this dude, and he could do no wrong. Like, anytime Canterbury came down and got the ball to the hoop and Nathan Wilson was there, watch out. Like, he doesn't fuck around. Like, he's going to block your shot. And he's a ball of energy as well. He's mobile, he's big, and I'm going to go out on a limb to set up this NBL discussion. I don't know how good the Huskies are going to be, Wildcard. Maybe you can help me out there. But Nathan Wilson is my cult hero status player of the NBL this year. Post-pandemic restart antics. I'm all about Nathan Wilson, and I'm going to pay close attention to the Auckland Huskies and Nathan Wilson because he is my cult hero favorite NBL player based on the few minutes that I saw in that first game. So I'll pass it over to you. If you've got any thoughts on Nathan Wilson, he does have a highlights package on YouTube as well from like the National Secondary Schools Tournament, I think it was last year. So you can check that out on YouTube. Just search Nathan Wilson basketball. Do you have any thoughts on Nathan Wilson, Wildcard? Or do you have a different player that you're going to put in your cult hero status that is mandatory viewing for yourself to go up against my pick of Nathan Wilson?
Well, I do have some thoughts on young Nate Wilson with the albatross wingspan there. Because the interesting thing about him was he was a 12th round pick for the Huskies. So, like, when you think about all the conversation leading up to this NBL showdown and the various, like, necessary but still kind of somewhat regrettable kind of sacrifices that had to be made to get here, and the shortened time span and all this, and the minimal preparation, which I think was maybe the one that grinded on me the most, was that you could have just started this next week and given teams a little bit longer to actually train together and be prepared. Would that have made that much of a difference? I don't know. Or even just on like Friday night or something, big reveal. But also the way the competition is structured, you also have to admit that because like every team is going to make the playoffs to at least some degree, like the bottom 2 place teams have a playoff to then face the like 3rd place team or so, which is effectively playing in for the quarterfinals kind of thing. Like, everyone gets that lifeline at the end. It's harder if you're at the bottom, but it's not all over just because of that, which means that you can afford to take the first week or two, especially just to play yourself into form and rhythm and work on those combinations kind of on the fly. So I think that's also a thing to keep contextually in mind. But the lack of some of the top players has also been, and you see a few of them, like a lot of the Breakers guys have been sitting in the crowd watching. I've seen Tom Abercrombie went on the tally at one point. Corey Webster was there with Ty Webster as well, sitting with him. Their dad is the assistant coach for Franklin Bulls, I think it is. Interesting story on the Franklin Bulls as well, with their main coach, Liam Simmons is his name. He's an Australian dude with a slightly American accent. He's actually the brother of Ben Simmons from the 76ers. The reason he's got an American accent is because he's been over there for quite a while, coaching at a college level and coaching with the 76ers in a capacity like working with his brother, half-brother technically, but, you know, brothers, it's the same thing. So cool story there that I had no idea about. One of those many little nuggets that have emerged in the from this NBL already, just in the first couple of days. Not in the least of which another one of those nuggets being the Otago Nuggets re-emerging after several years out. But regarding some of the players that aren't there, like obviously it would be nice to have the Webster brothers and guys like that. But then the flip side of that is if you had a lot of those guys, a fella like Nate Wilson wouldn't be playing. Like, he was a 12th round pick. He wouldn't have been picked up by one of these other teams if a few more of the top Tall Blacks. Like, and you can't have watched that just like incendiary little spell he had for the Huskies and thought like anything other than this is a dude who knows that this is his opportunity to shine. Like, he's out there doing absolutely everything he can to make a name for himself, and he did. Like, and that's the opportunity that so many other players in his position are gonna have as well. So I kept an eye out during yesterday's games as well, and throughout all, I've watched all 4 of the games so far. As of time of recording, and I mean, keeping an eye out for other guys in that sort of situation. I haven't settled on anyone in particular. There's a few names we can go through later, some of the better performers and stuff like that. But it's just I really like that idea of just the open book of guys like Nathan Wilson, for example, who can just come in and say I'm a little bit lucky, a little bit fortuitous that things have worked out the way they have, that I've got this opportunity, but god damn it, I'm not going to let it slide, you know what I mean?
Definitely loosen up your cult hero status borders there a bit, and just parlay it into who's your favorite player from that, because that's essentially what I'm saying. Old mate Jared Kenny, pretty damn cool. I like the look of Tom Vodanovich. He's involved in everything. I like watching the Nuggets, like the Jared Kenny and Ngatai duo, which didn't feel overly sustainable because it was kind of only awesome when they were both on the court together, but I like watching it and I enjoy watching those two together. All of that is secondary to my fascination with Nathan Wilson. But I say all of that just to set this up as just who is your favorite player from that opening couple of nights that isn't deeper in the depth chart for that cult hero status, but is cult hero status in the fact that they're just your favorite player and they might be someone else's favorite player to keep an eye on.
Yeah, some of the guys I've been sort of paying a little more attention to for that reason, guys I've tried to keep just a little bit of a line on because I haven't really seen them before. Those dudes who are coming back from college, so and a lot of those guys exactly the same kind of thing. They got a bit of a chip on their shoulder. They haven't either they've most of them probably played NBL in the past before they went over to the States, or even possibly in between seasons and stuff. I don't know if that's a possibility or not, but they've maybe been on the scene before, but going away to few years in the America, learning your trade like that, becoming just more of a growing as a person as well, and then coming back and really just looking to assert themselves like that. I think Isaac Davidson was a dude for Franklin who was just coming in and knocking down 3-pointers all over the show. What did he score, 27 points or something in that game? His teammate Sam Timmons is another one who's we're not going to get to see Jack Sold, unfortunately, because he got injured. Sam Timmons is a dude who has not to the same success because he wasn't as good of a school while he was over there, but Sam Timmons had a similar kind of college career to Jack Sold, where it's some games he's barely going to play, just as that big man, the Andrew Bogut kind of role big man. Some games minimal factor, other games maybe he'll get a bunch of touches and a few finishes at the rim and get a bunch of rebounds and be a little bit of an undercover hero, but every single game he's going to go out there and do exactly what the coach asks and give you 100%, kind of one of those fellas. Didn't see a massive amount from him in that game for Franklin. Who was the other one I was trying to... Jaden Bazant as well. I thought he had a real tidy looking game. He had the old headband going as well, so he's clearly a fella after my own attention too. Been known to rock the old rolled up bandana myself at times. And a fellow who we didn't see in the first game as well, who's also on that same radar for me, is Isaiah Moriahuhu Leafa for the Huskies, who is I don't think I've seen him play at all, but he's got some big raps about him. He missed the first game, and hopefully we'll play the second and go carrying on, because I very much want to see what that fellow's all about. He went with the last pick of the first round as well, so it's not just a matter of people talking him up. There's also been a bit of money on the table from the Huskies, who have been we don't just think this guy is a useful prospect, we think this guy is the first player we want to put on our roster. So yeah, and a few names there to keep an eye on, fellas who have definitely done well. It's been interesting as well seeing a lot of the veterans, like you mentioned, Ngatai and Jared Kenny. Jared Kenny was excellent for the Nuggets, and that sort of, it was a come from behind win as well. They were down a fair bit for a while there. against, it was Manu 2, wasn't it? And they came back, and Jordan Natai had a clutch 3 near the end. They had a bit of a quiet second half, but Jared Kenny had kind of taken over in his stead. Jordan Hunt had a real good game for them too. I think that Natai Kenny, because the Nuggets are another one of those teams where it's like, they're fresh on the scene at the moment. They haven't been around for a little while, so guys they've got like more work to do in terms of molding guys together. Whereas if you look at the Canterbury team, for example, who, because of injury, don't have Jack Salt, don't have Joe Cook-Green, so there's 2 of their top 3 picks. They were fantastic. They blew out the Huskies in that game you mentioned before, and a lot of that is because they picked guys who have been around the Canterbury Rams in the past. Like, they prioritized the guys they would have had anyway, rather than getting like stars in the eyes and trying to pick best players from other teams or best available kind of thing. They stuck to their kind of foundations, I suppose, and because of that, you saw a team that was just ahead of the ball. Whether they can still be at that level, especially considering that they are missing, 2 of their top players. Whether they can stay at that throughout the whole 6 weeks is another task, but certainly at the start you could see the difference between a team that had players that were used to playing together and a team that did not. So, lots of various little wrinkles and things to think about with this NBL, and another reason why it's been pretty fascinating and continues to be fascinating just to see how everything unfolds, really.
So we got it's the Nelson ears, right? Nelson ears 2 from 2. Taranaki is. So
yeah, Nelson Giants is
nice. Nelson Giants, right? So you got the Taranaki ears 2 from 2. They're the only team who has played 2 games thus far. From those early the early stands of their wildcard, who is looking to you to be like teams and players who are going to be the most important? Like, players who are going to be the most important, and what team do you think is odds-on favorite at this stage? Like, I'm looking around, and Vodanovic is involved in everything. That dude was everywhere. If we're talking he reminds me of like a Nelson Asafa-Solomona in the sense that he's a big forward who moves pretty damn well. Like, I'm watching him get up and down the court. He moves around bloody well, but he's a big unit. He's a rugged unit as well, but he's got the athleticism to be a factor everywhere on the court, if that makes a bit of sense. Otherwise, I'm just talking out of my ass. You can let me know about that as well.
No, it makes sense. It makes sense. I can see it too.
So I'm thinking Vodanovic is going to be one of the most important players. I can see after that performance, Jared Kenny is definitely going to be one of the more important players leading that Nuggets team around. So what players are you thinking are going to be most important, best players in the league, and how does that correspond to like a couple of teams who are your favorites for the competition at this early stage?
Yeah, Tom Vodanovic is a really fascinating case as well, because he was a Breakers development player 2 years ago. He was then a Breakers full contracted player last year, getting one of those sort of late roster spots for them. At a time when the Breakers were copping a whole lot of heat for not showing a whole lot of interest in the local game at the top level anyway. Very good when it comes to the community side of things, but when it comes to like the structures in basketball New Zealand, the Breakers under their current regime perhaps have left a little to be desired, and there have been a few nice little touches where they've kind of thrown some olive branches out there. Getting Ethan Rusbatch on as a sort of injury replacement player is another one of those, and Tom Vodanovic playing last year was one. But I think Vodanovic probably feels like he didn't quite get the opportunities he would have liked in that year with the Breakers, and he's off contract currently. I didn't realize the bloke could shoot 3-pointers as well. I mean, I knew he could do the hustle stuff in the paint. No dramas there because he's been doing that in the NBL for a couple of years, but the fellow was just knocking down, especially in that first half of that game, he was knocking down 3-pointers all over the show. I had no idea he could do that. I think at one of the halftime interviews or something, he popped up and sort of said, like Casey Frank asked him about that, and he said, well, isolation, you can't do a whole lot of work other than just shooting practice. So I guess he's just in the backyard with the ball and a hoop and just throwing him down. So him and also Jordan Natai is in exactly the same situation where off contract at the Breakers. probably unlikely to get another contract. But if they're going to, I mean, this is the stage in order to prove that you deserve it. I have noticed Coach Dan Shamir popping up on the telly broadcast. He's certainly been there or thereabouts, having a good close look at some of these things, so that's a good sign. So yeah, Natai and Vodanovic, for those reasons, are two players. Also, Natai was the number 1 overall pick, and Vodanovic was, I think, the 3rd. I think that's right. So, two also highly talented players who are going to be leaders for their team. But I think, in terms of I mean, I don't know exactly what to think about Canterbury, because that asterisk with the not having Joe Cook-Green and Jack Salt makes me wonder they could possibly get some decent injury replacements in there and really actually improve their team upon what we saw in the first game. But I also don't think the Huskies were up to much. So I'm not a little bit of reservation about Canterbury at the moment. So I think after having seen everyone play once and Taranaki play twice, I think the Otago Nuggets and the Taranaki Mountaineers are the two teams that I would, at this very, very, very early stage, put up on that little pedestal and say, these are your title favourites probably at the moment. The Nuggets, because are just very impressed by their roster, for one thing, but also by the fact that I think because of what I was saying before about them being a new team, I think that sort of Ngatai, Kenny Hunt kind of combinations, they're only going to get better as they play together more often, and they have the right kind of, someone like Jared Kenny is as much of a veteran presence as you can hope for. He's gonna run the show. You're not going to go astray under that kind of guidance. You're going to be pretty that they should make those strides, is what I'm saying. So there is certainly a team to watch out for, and I think Taranaki Mountaineers with they were really good. Both their first two games. Daron Ruakawa looks outstanding. Got Marcel Jones, one of the few import fellas in this competition. Ty Wynyard's there as well, doing a few things. He's certainly beefed up a bit since I last saw him. Ty Wynyard. He hadn't been able to play a whole lot because he had back injury, which pretty much ended his college career after he'd already transferred away from Kentucky to try get more game time. Then I think he got about 3 minutes as a development player in the Aussie NBL for one of them teams last season. So he's at a little bit of a crossroads, and he is a player in an interesting situation. But this is also another opportunity for him to show what he can do. But also, he doesn't have to be they also got Shane Tomato there, who's another top quality player. They've just got a pretty stacked roster, Taranaki, and led by Ruakawa and Jones is pretty intimidating based on those first few games, especially with the level of point scoring that those two are laying down. And also I'll add that Daron Ruakawa is the best post-game interview I've seen so far, and it's not even close.
Shout out to Daron. The NBL and UFC feel like two competitions in the world that are better off for the situation that the world found itself in over the past 2 to 3 months, maybe 4 months. NBL's come out with we can analyze all the details, we can pick apart their restart strategies, even the need to restart, which so soon, which is a bit weird given the state of the world. We can pick apart all these things, but just in dealing with how the UFC and NBL, where they're sitting right now, to me, they feel like two competitions that are better off for the lockdown and the quarantines and the pandemic, just with how they have emerged from that period. Do you have any thoughts on that? And I'll give a few examples of competitions that I am less convinced are better off. And it's not necessarily because they've done something wrong or anything negative. It's just so it's less of a indictment on the competitions themselves and the people organizing it for doing a shit job or something. It's not about that. It's just about the circumstance these competitions, these leagues, these sports find themselves in at this stage. And I will use Super Rugby as an example. So Super Rugby came back, full stadiums, everyone's buzzing, it's cool. But right now, we don't know like what the future of Super Rugby is. We don't know if it's just going to be if Super Rugby Aotearoa is just going to continue to be what it is. We don't know if there's going to be international involvements, like the presence of the Japanese team, the presence of South African teams, the presence of the Argentinian team. All of that stuff is up in the air coming out of the pandemic. So in the rugby example, they've got their sport back. That's cool. Honkadori, big stadiums, good rugby, everything's cool. However, there is immense uncertainty as to how Super Rugby looks moving forward. And if I switch over to the NRL came back and put a lot of effort into coming back, and they were kind of along with the UFC in coming back super duper early. And the way I view that is that they kind of live on a rogue basis. Like, they don't feel like the UFC isn't intertwined with the sensitivities and all the minutia that other competitions in the USA are involved in. Like NBA right now, trying to get the NBA back, that feels like an absolute mess just because of all the different factors involved. And I think my point here is that Dana White is just a bit more of a crazy man, and he led the UFC to come back. So obviously being a crazy man like Dana White is good and bad. But in this instant, being, a rogue operator, being a bit different, being far more on your own, worked out for the UFC, and they were able to come out in a better position. I think the NRL is a similar case. Like that Peter V'landys dude just came out Hundies, he was going hard, and NRL's coming back, fuck what anyone else says. Like that kind of attitude, I think, is what led to the NRL and the UFC coming back as they did. However, I'm also not convinced that the NRL is going to be better off for what they did necessarily. I kind of feel like everything is just crazier in the NRL, and all the craziness just got condensed into what we have now, where there's just so much noise around the NRL as far as like news and rumors, and it just doesn't feel like the NRL is better off for what they've gone through. Like, it's not a negative. They're present, they're making their money, they're putting on their show, they're putting on their entertainment. That's all cool. However, I do not feel like they are better. They are in a better position now than they were, not before the pandemic, because there wasn't much rugby league there, but before like last year or whatever it is. UFC and NBL genuinely feel like they are better off for the pandemic. And once again, like, we can pick apart the NBL and pick at details, but just on a broader general picture, I just feel like the NBL is in a better position than it has been in the past. And you can look at broadcast deals and all that stuff that had to be rejigged, and they've done a good job of it. So do you have any, you can take it anywhere. You could throw up some different examples at me of other competitions that you think are better off for the pandemic, or maybe not so better off. Because I do think that there are competitions that are still very murky. They're like, Super Rugby is being played, but the future's unclear. NRL just doubled down on being a bit of a shit show and a bit of a TV drama, which isn't always good. So do you have any thoughts on those kind of ideas? Competitions that are better off, competitions that may seem better off, but aren't actually better off, and just how do you feel about all of that?
Yeah, I think there's like two different types of returns here, which you've got the sort of UFC / NBL type return, and I mean, the NBL still has questions about, like, similar questions to what you're saying about Super Rugby, because there are 3 teams that chose not to participate, Hawke's Bay, Wellington, and Southland, all of whom were semi-finalists last year, so 3 of your very top teams did not want to be a part of this particular thing, which isn't a coincidence. I think also the best teams are going to have the best rosters, are going to be the least interested in sharing players around and what the damage that might do to relationships and things like that. So it's like semi-understandable. I don't have a very nice taste in my mouth about some of the criticism that have come from some of those teams about the league. It's like you chose not to be a part of it, which is okay. You had your reasons, but like other teams chose to be a part of it for the other same, like for their own reasons as well. Like, there's a bit of perspective going on there, and some of the criticism I think has been unfair, especially considering like these teams don't exist if it's not for this league. It seems like everyone should be trying to work together, but whatever. There might be some like, some sticking plasters needed for a few wounds in order to get things going back in a normal format next year. So I will chuck that little asterisk out there for the NBL, but at the same time, what you're seeing at the moment, first couple days as far as that goes anyway, of excellent entertainment. It's also like one other sort of accidental, it's not a deliberate factor of this thing, but the way it's worked out, you're seeing an overwhelming majority of Kiwi players as well in the NBL, which is just adding another dimension, which is really kind of enjoyable. Like it's improved it in a way. You're not just seeing a couple American imports dominating each team kind of thing. You're actually getting New Zealand players who might have normally been like, you're getting those guys like we're talking about Nate Wilson before, someone who wouldn't have got an opportunity to be on a roster otherwise. But you're also like, that's cool, that's great. You're also though seeing guys like maybe Tom Vodanovic as an example, who would I'll say Durham Rukawa maybe is an even better example. Someone who is a very good player, would have been a starter in this league regardless, but maybe wouldn't have been getting the same level of like ball handling opportunities, not the same amount of shots, not the same amount of like control. He gets to be an absolute leader for his team now, as opposed to just being a starting five and a reliable, important player. He's actually now a key player, which is like, there's a lot of guys in that sort of buffer have been pushed up. Majority of whom being New Zealand players as well, which is also cool to see. So like lots of fun little stuff like that. But the thing that matters the most as far as the NBL's reputation moving forward is that this has never been, like they've never ever had this level of exposure before. And it's not just like the ESPN deal, because I'm skeptical again how much like that's nice, and hopefully you'll get some college scouts having a good old peek and things like that, and overseas scouts, and for professional teams, maybe even like there's a lot of good that can come from that. It's not going to suddenly become the second best league in the world just like behind the NBA just because it's on TV at 4:00 in the morning in America. But that exposure is important. But the exposure within the New Zealand scene is the most important. Like it's getting games on Sky every night, being able to make an event of it in the way that they've done it. It's just capitalizing on what was an awkward situation and using that crisis as an opportunity for progress. And the NBL is going to be in a better place because of it. Like they've capitalized in a good way, even though there were like sacrifices made to get to where they are. Players who aren't involved who otherwise would have been, teams who aren't involved who otherwise would have been. The league as a whole, as the brand of the league and all these things, enormously improved because of the way they've been able to get this thing out there and what they're doing so far, and the buy-in they've got from broadcasters and all sorts, and sponsors and media and these kind of things. It's great. Like it's fantastic. That's one way of doing things, like to bring a league back in a way where you can actually like make improvements and change things. Use this as an opportunity to implement things that can hopefully moving forward continue to be a factor. In the NBL's case, it's that exposure, and sort of like I don't know which way this will go. This could easily backfire and be a negative, but we'll keep it on the positive, and let's say that that's changing of the timing of the A-League season for next year is going to be a good thing. We'll see how that goes, but it's certainly at least something. Like they've tried something. At least they're doing something to try and improve what they're. The second way of doing things is what you're seeing from the NBA, which is just purely like it's almost like a reluctant return. Like I think if you took out all the financial aspects of it, the NBA wouldn't be playing. Like the main impetus, and like players want to play, they want to award a championship, they want to finish what they started with the season, all those things, exactly the same things you can say about the English Premier Leagues, the Spanish Liga, the Italian stuff as well, German stuff, which is almost finished now. Not the French. The French abandoned their league, so did the Dutch, and they're probably like, it's awkward for them, but they might also because of this, get to start their seasons with crowds in a normal time, so that's kind of cool for them, if that actually works out positively. But these other big leagues rushing back because they have to make the money. And it does almost seem reluctant, and there's those two kind of different ways you can do this. You can use this as an opportunity to shake things up and try be ambitious for the future and make things happen, or you can use this as not so much an opportunity as something you feel forced to do, because otherwise it'll be an even bigger crisis. It's going to be a crisis if you do, a crisis if you don't. But the money ultimately talks, and we just have to find a way, no matter the compromises we have to make along the way, just to finish something so we can put something out there, appease the broadcasters, keep fans happy, and make basketball or football or whatever sport we're talking about happen just enough that things can maintain some semblance of normality. And we're seeing with the various the hoops the NBA have to jump through, no pun intended, and just how many complications are spinning out with that. And there's also an element in the American Women's Soccer League, the NWSL, which has 4 prominent New Zealand players involved. One of them won't be involved in their little Challenge League World Cup style tournament that they're doing. Ali Riley's team were all set to partake in everything, and then 10 different players and staff from what would have been their bubble tested positive for coronavirus. So they've actually pulled out of the tournament entirely, which is rough going, but it's another example of when you try to rush things back ahead of the natural timeline. I'm sure the NWSL will still have a good tournament and all that, and hopefully there are no other complications, but it just shows there's the sad thing as well for them is they were trying to do what the NBL was doing. They were trying to deliberately be the first team back because the Women's Soccer League just doesn't get the reputation it deserves. And if that was the case, they would hopefully boost themselves in that way. And hopefully that will still be the case, even though there's just one fewer team participating. But yeah, the NBA is the one I keep coming back to. Is just every couple days there's just a new watch bomb about some big old speed bump in the road. And at some point just feels is this worth it? But then at the same time, they're still a month away from actually restarting. So maybe this is just the NBA being nice and diligent. I don't know. But yeah, it seems to me there's 2 different ways this kind of thing works. You either get ambitious about it and try to make it into an opportunity, or you just go through the motions because you feel you have to, because it's too expensive not to.
That was kind of the basis of my thinking around sports, around this topic, was I think I have a bad feeling about the NBA, and I just see there's just too much stuff going on. It's a shit show. Whether it's not in a negative sense, but in the sense that there's a lot happening, and it feels, I think the best way to come out of the lockdown and the pandemic and emerge in a better position, it was built for competitions that did have that rogue vibe, that did have the ability to operate outside of the web, the spider web of, just the systems and everything involved. And that's what the UFC feels like, and that's what the NRL felt like, that's what the NBL feels like. But comparing the UFC to the NBA is far more suitable, because they're operating on a similar level as far as revenue and profile around the world goes. But I've been thinking about the NBA a lot, and obviously we both absorb a lot of NBA content as well, and it's just the amount of factors that are going into whether players want to be involved or whether it's actually possible, and just all the contradictions and security on a biological level. You've got this rule, but then this rule contradicts that rule. All of that stuff is there in the NBA restart. And I won't say that I feel like the NBA is not going to, this NBA season is not going to happen, because there's a lot of smart people involved who want it to happen and need it to happen, kind of. but I definitely have had a feeling over the last week or so that it's just very difficult for the NBA, and I view that as more of a product of the spider web they're involved in terms of the web being connected to so many different things that form the web and then restrict the NBA in that situation. If you catch my, what is it called? Metaphor thing, whatever it is. Whereas the more rogue operator like the UFC or those who closer to home who took the opportunity and took that opportunity to come out swinging with creativity and different ways of going about it, they did so without that spider web like restricting them, without that spider web holding onto them and drawing them back down. And I think that is just a interesting factor here, because everyone looks at the NBA because the NBA is tied into a lot of the political and social stuff that's happening in the USA as well. And that's going to restrict what the NBA can do. And we're seeing it with players voicing their concerns and frustrations around whether to use the NBA as the restart as a platform, whether they can better use their resources, which is themselves, to be, have 10 toes on the ground and be there and helping people and doing that stuff. So I found it interesting thinking about this stuff and thinking about like the mechanisms behind these sports that allow them to come back in a better off position. Even like Super Rugby, like they just waited it out. They had their ducks in a row. They made the decision to come out with Super Rugby Aotearoa. And while I don't think they're going to be better off, they're in a good position. Like they're selling tickets, they're putting on a show, everything's cool. And it's just like, obviously in New Zealand, like everything's opened up, so anything can happen in New Zealand right now, and that obviously plays a huge factor in all of this. But I think the idea of just looking around different sports competitions and seeing the mechanisms that run those sports competitions and maybe the reasons behind wanting to restart and how they're going about it. I think the spider web analogy is a powerful image to have here. You just imagine yourself, you're either like the UFC and you just spark it up, you're gone rogue, you don't give a fuck, and there's no spider web. Like, there's only a couple of strings that are like just pestering you and just being annoying. And then you look over at the NBA, they've got a full-on spider web that's just holding them there, and they've got different bits and bobs that are just factors as well. So I think it's just an interesting thought to process in your head when you're looking around Australasia and sports competitions that are restarting or have already started. But more importantly, when you're looking around the world and you're seeing different bits of news and different bits of information, just ponder to yourself all the mechanisms that are behind that sport, and might be a reason why that sport hasn't got to the other point that other sports have, and so on.
And it's very easy to tell why that is in America as well, because you've got so much going on. Even like on a sort of social justice side of things, for sure, when you've got the protests that are going on and everything like that, I thought from the start that the NBA coming back would only be good for those, because NBA is quite forthcoming with being, progressive on those kind of things, and I thought you get all these NBA players back playing basketball. Like, I figured, like, with the exception of like the top stars, LeBron James can do whatever he wants because LeBron James speaks and people listen because he's LeBron James and he's earned that. Not just on the basketball court either, but just throughout his life he's earned that kind of respect. But a lot of other players who wouldn't, they wouldn't have the same platform if they didn't have the basketball to be able to make a statement during or after or before a game or at halftime or whatever, like, is bigger than them sending out a tweet kind of thing, you know what I mean? Like, it seems like that would be just a boost for them. But beyond that, I mean, that you could take that aspect out of it entirely, and America is still in an absolute state because you've got just no level of cooperation when it comes to the pandemic stuff. There's zero leadership coming from their government. Obviously, no one would have expected that, but the states are all just in wildly different perspective of what they should be doing and what they shouldn't, and doctors are out screaming, you can't do this, and then people are ignoring them saying, well, what about my freedom? And it's just a mess of a country, but we knew that. But it's just these are things that make things even more complicated. The metaphor I had in my mind, I do like the spiderweb one. The metaphor I had in my mind before was like, it's kind of like driving a car down the road. Like, it takes I guess it takes a certain amount of expertise to operate a vehicle, but not that much. I mean, you know how to, and these are experts in the NBA that are doing what they're doing as well. So it's not that hard to drive a car down a road in a straight line to get from A to B. That's nice and easy. But it gets a lot harder when you got like traffic swerving across and like pedestrians running in front of the road, and you've got like I don't know, here's a cow crossing the street, and there's a like just think of a fruit cart tumbling over, and then suddenly there's just an immeasurable number of just hazards, the kind of things you got to watch out for, and just complicating factors entirely. And what could, if things were all nicely suited, would just be a nice, straight, easy drive, suddenly becomes an absolute like hazard, and there you go. They're just getting more and more difficult. The interesting factor that I've been sort of stuck on the last few days is the players, not responsibility, but I guess just decision. I guess just the players' decisions when it comes to this kind of thing. Because there's a few NBA players that have already backed out. Avery Bradley is one who said, like, for incredibly righteous reasons, he said, like, I've got a young son who has respiratory issues. Therefore, he would not be allowed to join him in the bubble in, Disney World, wherever it is they're setting the thing up. His son wouldn't be able to join him. So there's two aspects to that. One is he's putting himself at risk of catching the disease, and then at a later stage bringing it back to his son, who would be at a big risk of that. Alternatively, he also has to spend a lot of time away from his son at a time when, like, the pandemic's not going away just because the NBA has figured out how to make a bubble. Everyone else in society, in America especially, is still at risk. So, perfectly reasonable decision from him. But then you've also got, like, Davis Bertans as an example on the other side of things, who said, like, he doesn't want to risk his health when he's had a couple ACL injuries in the past, coming up towards free agency, had a really good season, made a great account of himself, and he doesn't want to risk the future of his career. And it's this kind of, like, it's load management, but it's load management to the extreme. Like, at least with Kawhi Leonard's famous load management type stuff, you know, he's prioritizing the playoffs and making sure he's at the best possible version of himself physically when it comes to those playoffs. This is more in that Le'Veon Bell in the NFL kind of thing, where he set out an entire season, his last season with the Pittsburgh Steelers, so that he could get a better free agency offer. And then, by the way, signed with the New York Jets. So don't really understand what the point of that was, when you could have been part of the last year where that Pittsburgh team had this incredible offense, and decided to go play for the Jets. I hope he's getting paid nicely, because he's not winning many games with them. He didn't have the best year last year either with the Jets, because, I don't know, because he was playing for the Jets basically. So, like, this is an increasing trend that you see in American sports in particular, is this kind of prioritizing that next contract thing. And there's a different version of it in the NWSL as well, where Megan Rapinoe isn't going to play in this Challenge Cup. She's the only player from the formerly Seattle Reign. They're now called the OL Reign, because they're sponsored or owned/sponsored by, or owned specifically by Olympique Lyon for the French team, which is a weird situation. I guess it's similar to how that you have that Melbourne City, Manchester City, New York City thing going on. So she's the player from that team who hasn't wanted to be a part of it. There were whispers from the start that some of the top American national team players didn't want to play because they felt it was going to be rough on them physically. A lot of games in a short amount of time on an artificial surface as well, which is the dumbest part of the whole lot of it. So the Olympics are on next year. That's the priority for these players. Some of them are sitting out because they want to make sure they're fit for that. I just, like, I understand that on a conceptual level, but if I was a teammate of Megan Rapinoe's or Davis Bertans, I would be kind of furious, or Le'Veon Bell, for example, although he was notoriously, despite what people said in the media, his teammates at the Steelers actually supported him fully the whole way through. I guess that's just more of the culture in the NFL, I don't know. But I would be kind of furious if someone backed out like that in that kind of way. Like, I couldn't imagine myself in that situation not playing for those reasons. It's slightly different if you compare it to the NBL here, where you have like Breakers players not playing. That's a little more understandable that you wouldn't play a short-term amateur competition and risk your health for the one that actually pays your bills. But it's slightly different when you're an NBA player trying, like, auditioning for a new contract. I don't know, because Bertans will not be the only player who goes down that line. I don't want to single him out because there'll be a lot more. I don't know, I just have a weird feeling about that kind of situation, because on the one hand, I understand how you gotta look after your livelihood like that. On the other hand, it's just like the competitive side in me. I couldn't ever imagine voluntarily not playing the sport that I loved, you know what I mean? Like, I couldn't sit it out for those kind of reasons. And I think there's also a slightly philosophical aspect in this, which is, I guess, a reason why I would also have that same hold up, is if you start playing to prevent injuries, that's generally when you start getting injured, you know? It's when you are just playing and in the rhythm and not worrying about it, you're less likely to be injured, and you just got to find that zone rather than overthinking these kind of things. But I don't know, it's a factor that's flying all over the show at the moment, particularly in America, because it's just continuing on a cultural trend. But this is, again, thrown back to my old pandemic thing. The pandemic doesn't so much bring out new problems as it exaggerates old problems, and this is one of those ones that seems to just be getting the microscope treatment at the moment, or at least it seems like fresh for that kind of treatment.
I don't necessarily label this as a problem, but my concluding thought would be there's a lot of Kiwis who like to follow sports around the world, and especially USA sports, and completely ignore sports within Aotearoa and the semi-professional, like the highest level of that sport in Aotearoa is often ignored for an international sport. So my concluding thought is all those people around Aotearoa who only pay attention to sport in the USA, I think you're going to be waiting a bit longer. And I think you're going to be encountering a couple more problems down this path. And I would encourage you, based on that, wrong, to tune into some more Kiwi sport. And because that is a problem that I think, as you're alluding to, will be being exposed. As there's a lot of people around Aotearoa who only care about sport in the USA and completely ignore the sport within Aotearoa. Well, look at the USA. It's an absolute shambles at the moment. Who knows when their sports are coming back, because coronavirus hasn't ended. Social justice issues haven't ended. All of that is going to impact your favorite USA sport. So you can either hang on to that and cling on to that for dear life, or you can just come back to Aotearoa and enjoy the plethora of sports here in the land of the long white cloud that we call home. Kia kaha. Raise your mana. Get out, get your socks off, get your shoes off, and just walk around Aotearoa. So wherever you are in Aotearoa, and connect to the land. Get your feet, your bare foots on that cold land of Aotearoa and just feel the energy. Stay beautiful, enjoy the weekend, and we'll be back early next week for some more Kiwi sporting yarns. Choo-choo-choo!